So welcome everyone. Good evening. Welcome for those of you joining us this evening in person and online to this event designed to launch the new book of Professor Christopher Phillips, Battleground: 10 Conflicts That Explain the Middle East. My name is Rita Plani. I'm a senior policy fellow working at LSE, both LSE Ideas and Middle East Center, where I look after a program that looks at the conflict not only in Syria, but also the wider Middle East, focusing particularly on civil society and civic activities, not just violence in the region. Today's event will start with a short introduction of about 5 to 7 minutes from Christopher Phillips, and that will be followed by another short presentation by the respondent, Mr. Faisal Al-Yafai. And then we will open the ground for discussion. So there will be a lot of room for questions and answers. So today's event is really about discussion, it's going to be ordered. Please know that this event will be recorded and that pictures will be taken. So if you don't want the photo to be taken, please tell our event coordinator, Nancy. And after the event, copies will be available as well of the book to buy. I assume you will sentence.
Yes, please.
So, Christopher and Faisal, welcome to LSE. I'll start with introducing you. So, Christopher Phillips is Professor of International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. He joined Queen Mary in 2012, having previously worked as the Deputy Editor of the Syria and Jordan program of the Economist Intelligence Unit. He's also currently an associate fellow at the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and working primarily on Syria and the impact of the Syrian conflict on the region. He's also a co-curator of an exhibition titled "Syria: Story of the Conflict" at the Yale World Museum. And previously he was a visiting, or you're still, you were a visiting scholar at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University in 2014 and 15. He lived in Syria actually for 2 years in Latakia, Aleppo, and Damascus, right? Yeah. And Syria is his main area of interest. He wrote a book about Syria in 2016, The Battle of Syria, The Battle for Syria, International Rivalry in the Middle East, published by Yale University. Faisal Al-Yafai, let's learn today how to pronounce your name. Al-Yafai is the international editor at New York's magazine. He's a journalist, a playwright, and a partner at Hillenbrand Nord. He was previously an investigative journalist at The Guardian, based in London, and a documentary journalist for the BBC. And he has reported from across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Russia, and Indonesia. So I'm going to start with you, Christopher, with a presentation to tell us all about you.
Sure. Thanks very much. Do you want to hear me all right? Small audience, which is wonderful. Firstly, thank you all for coming and taking an interest in this book and the talk we're going to have about it. In many ways, as Reeves suggested, my initial interest in conflict in the Middle East as such was through the lens of Syria. And that was an area, a country that I lived in, that then erupted into this horrendous civil war. And pretty soon after that civil war erupted, I became, as a scholar of international relations, really interested in the external dynamics of that conflict. And the previous book that I wrote, The Battle of Syria, really focused on those external players and the way that, in my hypothesis anyway, from very, very early on, the war was pulled and pushed and shaped at least as much by external dynamics as internal dynamics. And what you saw was regional players weighing in, trying to push their own agendas. You then saw extra-regional players like the US and Russia doing the same. And as I came to the end of that project, I became very conscious that Syria wasn't actually unique. In fact, the same pattern of internal, external dynamics in a conflict was playing out in Yemen, in Libya, and in non-violent ways through the politics, say, of Lebanon, of the Horn of Africa, briefly Egypt, And it struck me that as I was coming to the end of that project, which was kind of 2016, 2017 time, that mechanism was quite a good way of understanding contemporary geopolitics in the Middle East. And so I set about a new project. So actually, thanks very much for your introduction, Reem. I haven't really worked specifically on Syria for about 5 years now. I've now looked much more broadly at the wider Middle East through that lens of conflict. And what I decided to do in the project that became this book was use the mechanism of conflict as a way of introducing the international relations of the Middle East. But in particular, what I was interested in was trying to present this in a way that was accessible for the general reader. So I find this a lot with my students that, you know, we academics write these quite weighty tomes full of references, you know, interesting, I hope, but often quite hard to access. And it struck me that I could try to package my analysis in a way that would act as that kind of softer introduction to the complexities of the international relations, of the Middle East. And so I packaged the book in a very populist title, 10 Conflicts That Explain the New Middle East. And the idea behind that was, in a very similar way, I owe a debt, and I'm very open about this, to Tim Marshall's Prisoners of Geography, the idea that you could have a book that goes through 10 different episodes that you can look at individually, or you can look at collectively. And that's what I've done here. So what I've tried to do is look at 10 different conflicts that you can read the standalone chapters as just a brief introduction to that conflict or to that situation, or you can read all 10 as a whole and get an overview of the geopolitics of the Middle East through the lens of conflict. The 10 conflicts that I chose, and when I say conflict, I decided to look not just at violent conflict, although that is a factor, but also at political contestation. So sometimes where there's situations like Lebanon, Iraq, Kurdistan, where there might not necessarily be everyday violence in the kind of civil war sense, but there is a degree of contestation. And importantly, there's contestation that it also involves external powers. You find outside actors weighing in the politics of these states. So what I focused on was four violent conflicts, which were Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Palestine. I then looked at what comes next in the order, Iraq, Egypt, and Lebanon, which are sort of non-violent contestation. And then I look at regions, I look at Kurdistan, I look at the Gulf, and I look further afield at the Horn of Africa. And in each of those, I tell a similar story. So I talk about what's going on internally, I talk about the history, I talk about the legacy of colonialism, I talk about the legacy of what people might call neo-imperialism, especially the recent involvement of the United States in the politics of the wider Middle East. I then look at the internal politics of what's going on, why there's been contestation, sometimes violent, in these states. And then I look at the role of external players in exacerbating and worsening that contestation. So I look at extra-regional actors, I look at the US, Russia, China, the EU, and I look at powerful regional players that are doing the same. Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Turkey. And as you can see, there's a golden rule of 10 there. I'm focusing on 10 states or regions which are intervened in and 10 interveners. And in each chapter, I will zoom on in a particular external intervener. So in the Syria chapter, I look at Russia. In the Egypt chapter, I look at the US. But again, the idea is that you can read all these chapters in turn and get an overarching view of both the 10 conflicts, but also the 10 interveners. So that's the kind of premise of the book. But at the same time, I'm an academic, so I'm trying to make an argument. I'm not trying to make it sort of what was the word that American students call a primer. It's not just a primer on international relations in the Middle East. It is making an overarching view. And the overarching argument that it's making is in the subheading. It's 10 conflicts that explain the new Middle East. I put forward the idea that actually it is worth looking at these 10 conflicts it's worth looking at them now because, in my view, the Middle East has undergone a significant change in the last 10 or 15 years that needs explaining. And I use a bit of data for that. For example, what you've seen in the Middle East in recent years is a massive increase in the amount of conflict. If you look at the data prior to 2000, so in the 20th century, even though the Middle East was perhaps caricatured as a region of conflict, when you think about things like the Arab-Israeli conflicts and so on, actually it was in line with conflicts elsewhere in the world. It was no more a violent region than other parts of the world. In fact, the most violent region in the world in the second half of the 20th century was Southeast Asia. But something changed from roughly the 2000s onwards. And today, the Middle East is the most violent region if you look at rather grim statistics like numbers of deaths per capita. So why? Why has that happened? And one thing that's really interesting that I looked at is the number of states intervening in conflicts. And that has shot up in number again. So of all the civil wars in the Middle East prior to the year 2000, sorry, 2008 rather, on average in the conflict, there was about 2 states intervening. And actually those numbers were massively skewed by 2 conflicts, which is the civil war in Lebanon and the civil war in Oman, which had loads of people intervening. By and large, civil wars in the Middle East didn't attract large numbers of interventions. Since 2008, on average, 6 countries have intervened in each of the 5 civil wars or conflicts that we would consider civil wars by political science definitions. So that's a huge increase from an average of 2 to an average of 6. Far more states are getting involved in these conflicts. And the question I asked is why has that happened? And I'll very briefly go through my hypothesis, and then I'm sure with Faisal we can talk about in more depth why I put that forward. There have been 4 major changes, structural changes in the Middle East that have brought about more. The first, and it's really important, is the changing role of the United States. The United States made its bid for hegemony or dominance in the 1990s and 2000s. Since really the failures of the Iraq War, it has consciously stepped back, or it is perceived to have stepped back, leaving something of a vacuum. It is still a powerful actor, it is still there, but it's no longer this dominant actor that it once was, which leads to a second shift, which is the changing behavior of the regional players in the wider Middle East. Previously, there have been a limited number of intervening states, many of whom actually outsourced the role of sort of policemen to the United States. But since the US has stepped back, you've seen an increase in activism, both from the US's enemies, like Iran, but also from its allies like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, now much more willing to go it alone and pursue their own policies independently. A third shift related to this is the growth in the number of weak, some might say even failed states in the region, the battlegrounds that I'm talking about, the number of arenas in which these rivalries can play out and in which these states can see opportunities to intervene. Now, that's related to the consequence of the Arab uprisings, 2011. Many states saw popular unrest and a descent into civil wars. Many would argue that rather than it being the fault of the Arab uprisings as such, it's more that was sort of perhaps I don't like to use the word inevitable, but a likely consequence of the parasitic dictatorships that existed in many of these states, which had hollowed out a lot of states. And when 2011 happened, you got this eruption of popular unrest and often leading to violence without sort of a solid enough state structure to hold together, again, allowing an opportunity for these external actors to intervene. And then a final factor, fourth factor, is the growth of non-state actors in these states. Now, again, it's connected to the third factor. When a state collapses or implodes, you need someone to fill the vacuum. That's when non-state actors emerge to provide services, to provide security. And of course, that provides a mechanism for those external actors to intervene. They'll sponsor non-state actors. In some cases, like Iran, they will create non-state actors to pursue their goals. So that allows for the conditions in which intervention in conflict is favorable, desirable for these both regional and extra-regional powers. the combination of which unfortunately leads to far more violence, far more instability in this region, and I believe contributes to the spike in the amount of violence and unfortunately deaths that we find in the region. So that's broadly what the book's about. It's told through this lens of these 10 conflicts. You see a similar pattern throughout each, but it's the overarching message is telling a story of a change in geopolitical and regional circumstances contributed to by the stepping back of the United States, or at least the perceived stepping back of the United States, the stepping into the vacuum by extra regional powers and regional powers, and the growth of non-state, of weak states in the region in which they can battle one another, and non-state actors within those states that can act as the, I suppose, lightning rod for external intervention. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So over to you,
One of the difficulties with trying to be a respondent to a book like this, especially an academic book, because academics are always very, very smart about couching it in terms where you can't disagree with them easily. They say it's a bit of this, it's also a bit of this. And so you can't easily kind of pin them down. And so thinking about coming here and talking about the book, I was trying to think about the points that I disagreed with. And actually, the modern technology makes it very easy, because now I read your book on PDF. So I could search for terms, and just make sure that does he mention this? And then I just check and go, that's definitely a point of disagreement. One of my points of disagreement, and this isn't going to be a whole conversation where I try to antagonize Christopher, although that is part of it. It's about delineating the differences between Chris's perspective and other people's perspective. And I think the usefulness of doing that is that those people in the room who are less familiar with the Middle East, which looking around the room seems to be pretty much nobody. So it's rather upsetting. It gives me the sense that I thought I'd come here and I would at least sit somewhere in the hierarchy of experts. But actually it looks like the experts are kind of looking at me. And so if I make a mistake, if I talk about Raqqa and it's not really Makkah, it's Manbij, can we just gloss over it and pretend it didn't happen? But one of the criticisms that I had with the book, one of the thoughts that I had about it, was about the refusal of the author to use the term Arab Spring. And you didn't, throughout the book, you didn't use this term, you used it once precisely. You kept calling it the Arab uprisings. Now, we'll come later to perhaps why you felt the need to do that. But I think it's indicative of something else. It's indicative of a perspective that privileges the external players and the outside responses to these uprisings and revolutions, rather than the internal ideas. Because when you talk about the retreat of the US creating a space for external actors, obviously that's right. And the Arab Spring certainly did create a lot of chaos, which allowed other people to walk in a way they couldn't have done 20 years earlier. However, you have to ask, why did the Arab Spring happen? What was it that these actors on the ground, these people on the ground, were seeking to do through the revolution? Because revolutions are a lot like occupations happening here. They're not just a collection of ideas, there's a collection of people, individuals. And so when you think about what's happening across the road of the Marshall Building, and you think about what's happening previously in the Arab Spring, it was a collection of individuals. This was not some group that went out. These were individual people that came to their own conclusion that they should go out on the streets. Why did they do that when they knew the results of protesting? Because nobody in any of these countries was under any illusions about what would happen to them. In fact, when the first Arab uprising broke out, the Egyptian or the Tunisian one, when it started to happen in Egypt, you will remember that the army, I'm sure somebody remembers, so back me up on this, I didn't make this up. The army in Egypt started to have virginity tests. Remember this? These were virginity tests which they imposed on women in Tahrir Square. Why did they do that? They did it because the women who were protesting, and the men as well, in the beginning, were not from the villages as the Tunisian uprising had when it first began, but they were from the elite, they were from the middle classes. And when you have a compact which says, stay out of politics, and we'll try and give you bread and circuses, which was the compact that the Mubarak regime had, you can't easily attack those people in Tahrir in the way that the Assad regime later did. Instead, what you have to do is make them understand the power of the state. And the way that the power of the state was expressed through the virginity test was a way of saying to middle-class parents who didn't want their daughters associating with people from the lower classes anyway, it was a way of saying, if this is what we will do to your daughters, imagine what we will do to your sons. And that was precisely what they were signaling in the beginning, and it's later what they did to those boys when they killed them. So I think when we're thinking about your book, we should be thinking a lot about why did they go out onto the streets? Why did they have these revolutions? Yes, there was intervention subsequently, but they were seeking to do something on the ground. They were seeking to change something. And it was that we should be thinking about the sets of ideas that they were seeking to implement, rather than the damage that came later in the intervention. I have other disagreements, but I feel like we should start with that,
Sure.
and then we'll come to.
It's a really interesting question, Faisal. Thanks for bringing it up, and I know there's people in this room who teach, so you'll understand the dilemma one has when you're picking the phrases to use, and actually Arab Spring is one of those phrases that's actually very controversial, because of course it wasn't a term that was utilized in the Arab world itself, right? You know, as Intifada al-Arabi was the phrase that was used, which is not spring. And actually the spring was a phrase that came up in Western media outlets. They were the ones that sort of came up with this. And it was very much this kind of, as I perceived it at the time, this way of actually Westernizing for want of a better word, indigenous movement from the Middle East. And the reason I have a problem with the phrase Arab Spring, and I used it at the time as well, when it happened, but when I teach, I don't use Arab Spring anymore. That's because it's not, it's not indigenous, so it is sort of why I'm continuing the sort of the Western media narrative. I use it, and also, no spring in history succeeded. Spring by their nature, that's the whole thing. We think about the other examples of springs, the Prague Spring. I remember when I was first studying Syria, the Damascus Spring of 2001, when Bashar al-Assad first came to power. The whole nature of it, the phrase implies because a winter's coming. It's a brief moment. So actually, I don't think it was accurate in describing what was taking place. I think uprisings actually is perhaps a better translation of intifada. I mean, that's how you view it. But I think actually as a phenomenon across the region, I think it's a better way of describing what's taking place. But that said, I don't hold it really kind of like I won't die on that hill. So if a lot of people read it,
square.
Exactly, down the square, exactly. One phrase I don't ever use though, and you came up with it, is revolution. Yeah. Because this is the cold, hard political scientists in me. There wasn't a revolution. There weren't revolutions. Revolutions by their nature have to actually bring about permanent change. You can have failed revolutions, which perhaps you did see in some cases, probably Egypt, the greatest example. Or Tunisia, I suppose, was the sort of the best example of a genuine revolution that lasted for perhaps a decade. And what we have now is something different. It's not sort of like the Ben Ali regime has not come back. You could make an argument that Sisi is an iteration of the army-dominated establishment from Egypt, but in Syria, I've always refused to use the word Balwa. I never used the word revolution when I was writing about it, because it was not a revolution. It did not change government in Damascus, which ultimately would be the description of a successful revolution, which is a controversial notion. I'm very conscious of it. And when we talked about it, with fellows sort of like, scholars of Syria, for example, whether or not you use the word revolution often indicated a political preference, right? So if you use the word revolution, then that implied you were sympathetic to the opposition. And if you didn't, it suggested some kind of sympathy for the regime. I do not have sympathy for the regime, but I did have that kind of like political science, like, oh, I'm not comfortable using the term revolution.
We can have more of a conversation. I like the way, I hope you all noted the way that Christopher tried to paint me as the Western student.
It's the media, it's the media.
But it isn't, I mean, the language is one thing. You
Yeah.
could use revolutions.
Yeah.
Plus, the definition of a revolution is something that political scientists impose upon a movement.
Mhm.
It isn't that there is some revolutionary idea out there about what revolutions are, and it always and everywhere applies to what we call the revolution, the American Revolution. So these things can be the revolution of ideas, which is, by the way, how the people on the ground saw.
Mhm.
And that was partly my criticism, but partly something that I wondered reading the book,
Mhm.
which is, it isn't merely that you don't take the language seriously. I don't think you take the ideas seriously
Of
what they were trying to do. I think you think too much about what happened after and these big powers that came in without saying what ideas were these young people trying to impose.
And you know, it's a valid criticism because, of course, I'm coming at it from the international perspective. You know, like the purpose of the book is to tell a story about international relations, and unfortunately, and it is a constant dichotomy or dilemma that we face as IR scholars is how much do you focus on the bottom up versus the top down, right? And it's a constant dynamic, and I hope that I kind of emphasize the importance of the agency of the actors on the ground that having brought something about. But at the same time, the story I'm telling is how those ideas, movements, actors on the ground interacted with the external. And for me, you know, you can't understand the fate of these movements without understanding the interaction with the external, because ultimately the reason I'm sitting here saying with my political science definitions of saying, well, that's not a revolution or not, is because these movements largely failed to get what they wanted. And I would argue the reason they failed to get what they wanted was because of that interaction with the external powers.
They failed so
far. Yeah, well, and there's a whole bigger discussion we can have. Is this, you know, is the Arab Spring the you know, and you know, a lot of people like to talk about it as the Arab world's 1989, which is incredibly patronising. But like, you know, it's about this idea that, you know, this could have a long-term effect, a long-term revolutionary effect. But you know,
is it patronising? Yeah. 1989 uprisings were put down, and then subsequently they succeeded.
No, the 89 ones were. You mean 1848?
Okay, now my
well, 1989 is in this moment when all the Soviet bloc countries moved from sort of communism to sort of like capitalism in a very swift movement. And at that moment in, you know, after Tunisia went and then Egypt went, there was this narrative, wasn't there, at the time that, oh, like, you know, the same thing's happening to the Arab world. The reason I say it's patronizing is because it's this suggestion that, well, that everywhere is fated to follow the same course of history as the West. And therefore, if you see two countries, you know, following a similar pattern, therefore, you know, let's reach back in history for a Western episode of history we can use to understand.
Yes, that is right.
Yeah.
Reed, you wanted to.
I wanted to remind you that you're talking to IR scholars.
Yes.
They're designed to look at areas like this too. So when you're looking at the internal dynamics, maybe, you know, the reason I sympathize with the science also to understand these dynamics. I have two questions to you actually. First, you cited 4 reasons why you think there's these violence. One of them is the increased number and role for non-state actors, especially violent actors. And we're seeing this worldwide. This is not just, you know, something to do with the region, but there is another factor, like the increased number of external countries that are intervening in the conflict. And it is well established in the literature about the civil war, is that the higher the number of external interveners in a conflict, the longer it's going to last. And this is universal, not just in the Middle East. So my question to you, this increase of number of external interveners, are we seeing this also worldwide or only in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's often based on region. You're not really seeing it worldwide to the same level as you're seeing in the Middle East.
Yeah.
What's actually really interesting, one of the sort of phenomena, I suppose, that I'm trying to sort of describe in the Middle East is that the structures of power, the balance of power between states, is not unique in the Middle East, but you don't see it in other parts of the world as much.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the lack of a dominant one or two powers, right? So if you think about other regions, you think about North America, obviously you've got the United States, you think Latin America, you've got Brazil and Argentina, East Asia, you've got China. The Middle East is, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, you have a relatively even spread of powerful state actors. Now, actually, the Middle East is interesting because they've changed over time. So, we talk about sort of 50, 60 years ago, we talk about maybe Egypt, Syria, Iraq, these sort of big players. All three of those are relatively weak states now, and we talk about states from further afield. So, Turkey, which previously didn't have much interest in the Middle East, Iran, which wasn't interested in the Middle East until 1979 in the same way, and then was blocked in by Saddam Hussein until 2003. Then Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, particularly UAE and Qatar, suddenly taking an interest in the Middle East beyond their own Gulf region for the first time. So that's what shifted, but that actually relatively even distribution of power means that there isn't a natural leader or hegemon. But you do have various attempts in history of states trying to be it. So NASA tried to be it in sort of the 1950s. Iran, to a point, is maybe trying to be it now. Turkey has aspirations to be this kind of neo-Ottoman stuff, but they all lack the capacity to actually be the United States of North America or the Brazil or the Argentina. And why in some ways it's similar to Europe in the 19th century or sub-Saharan Africa is that actually often leads to violence, because you get sort of multiple what I asked multipolarity, a multipolar world where actually you have different alliances forming and people trying to balance against one another. And that is unfortunately at the moment the inherent structure of the Middle East. In the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the US stepped in to try to impose a kind of, people call it a Pax Americana, wasn't that? But the idea is there was sort of the US trying to sort of be the policeman over this region, which allowed to a degree of, I would argue, artificial stability. But when it steps back from that, in essence, those structural flaws come back to the surface again, and you get a return to levels of violence. Now, I conclude in the book, that doesn't mean I believe that the US should return as a policeman. In fact, in many ways, the US, as I say, is very much the cause of a lot of these problems in terms of its attempts for hegemony led to awful policies like, the 2003 Iraq invasion, which had a massive regional sort of effect. So in essence, what I argue at the end of the book is the flaw of the US was trying to think it played this hegemonic role, and actually stepping forward in the first place, creating instabilities and imbalances. And actually, the US shouldn't attempt to play that role. It's for the regional actors themselves to somehow work out kind of, modus vivendi of sorts.
Right. So my second question, you said in your presentation that you use the mechanism of the conflict as a way to understand it.
Yeah.
And my question is it enough to understand anything through the lens of conflict? I mean, there are quiet periods, stable periods. What is it we're missing by not understanding these periods? Even during, you say you look at not just violent conflicts as political ones, but even during these political or violent conflicts, during conflict times, there are also non-violent dynamics, important social dynamics, civil society dynamics that kind of reveal the overall. If you jigsaw this together with the violent events, with the political events, you kind of understand the overall picture and maybe gear towards what Faisal was trying to focus on, which is the internal dynamics. So do you think the conflict time is enough to understand?
No, not at all. No. And I said this at the very beginning, it's this is one way of exploring one aspect of the geopolitics of the Middle East. I don't want at any point to give any kind of indication this is, the kind of definitive tone that will explain everything about the geopolitics of the interest relations of the Middle East. For me, it's a relatively straightforward way of introducing the region and its complexities to a general reader. But at the same time, why did I choose that mechanism? It's because, as I said, there has been this surge in conflict. It is unfortunately the way that many people, the general readers, do understand the Middle East. And it's a way of getting into that level of, you taking that first step into understanding the complexities of the geopolitics. But again, like I will say, I lace it with caveats at the beginning by saying I'm not trying for a moment to suggest this is the only way of understanding the international relations of the Middle East. I am in no position to make that kind of claim, and I don't try.
Thank you. So we open the floor now for questions from the audience. Please wait for the mic to come to you. There will be a roving mic before you ask a question, because we have audience on the Zoom. They need to hear your question. And please introduce yourself briefly, and please keep the question and comment brief as well. For those of us in the Zoom, I will be monitoring the questions as well. So please start, right?
Right. Based on Malazi, formerly ambassador of the Arab League in London. I'm very interested. I haven't read your book, Christopher, and now I will do that with some relish after hearing your presentation. But I'm wondering if I'm understanding you correctly. You're saying there's some big divide that separates the new Middle East as from what 2010 from the old Middle East, as I and many others have lived through, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and it's an idea that I want to get my head around. And maybe you're right. Maybe when I read your book, I'll be convinced there is this big structural divide, almost, if you like, historical divide. But I keep remembering going through so many phases of revolutions, wars, bloodshed, everything through the 50s, through the 60s. Have we forgotten the Yemen civil war, for example? Not this one.
The North Yemen civil
war. The one with Abdel Nasser and King Faisal, against each other. Lebanon, for God's sake, that was a big battleground where all sorts of regional and international players also to be. I mean, the list is long, but I'm just wondering whether this sort of question needs to be looked at, and maybe you're right. Maybe I will be convinced. Anyway, that's the idea I'd like to put forward.
Sure. Do you know, I'll answer, but I also like to hear what Faisal thinks about this, because I think it's a really interesting kind of
question wasn't directly.
No, it's fine. Because I think it's these key questions about periodization, which are challenging, right? In the book, I make much of the quote of my actually old PhD supervisor and professor here, Fred Halliday at the LSE, where he says, in the introduction to one of his books, he says, it seems that every decade in the Middle East you get, an event, and people say everything's changed, 9/11, Iranian Revolution, 6-Day War, whatever it may be, and actually, most things have stayed the same. And I agree with him on that. Most things have stayed the same, but that's not to say everything has. Exactly, right? And it's one of those, in my view. And originally, by the way, the subtitle wasn't the New Middle East; it was the Post-American Middle East, and the publisher thought that would make it too focused on a particular issue and would narrow the market. But you get the idea of why it's new. Is that shift in the role of the United States, for me, is the major structural change. Now, I don't place it in the book on a single date. I don't say, right, okay, it's 9/11, nothing like that. I say that actually you can look at three particular moments that change the dynamics. You have the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which actually has a bigger effect on the United States, which is basically this massive, the general public really move against the idea over time of boots on the ground and nation building. And it takes nearly 2 decades to get out of Afghanistan, but the basic sort of gut instinct is we don't want to play this role anymore that we want to play. So that's changed for the United States. 2008, the financial crisis, shifted the geopolitics of the world. You know, the shift of capital from the west to the east, the rise of China means that the world we're now living in, the multipolar world, was created from 2008 onwards in that sense. You know, because it gives a massive shift in distribution of economic power that hasn't really changed. And then the third date is 2011, well, really to December 2010, if we're talking about the Arab uprisings, Arab Spring, you know, which changes the situation in the region, which creates this situation that I talked about, where, you know, a growth of battleground, you know, weaker states. Previously, as you mentioned, we would talk about Lebanon as a weak state. After 2003, we would add Iraq to that. After 2011, we had Syria, Libya, Yemen to that, temporarily Egypt as well. So those three changes over time create the conditions that I'm describing to say, okay, from around 2011 onwards, something new is happening. But that doesn't mean that everything is transformed. It's just that sort of like that external, the role of external players in these conflicts has changed.
It's a really interesting question, and I think because the confrontational part of the conversation has moved on now, so I can now support Chris. But I think that the Chris's thesis does have a lot to recommend, because you do have to kind of chop up, you know, history and figure out where you are in a particular timeline. I think that actually I didn't know that about the subhead, and the subhead is very interesting because I think that the two things that you correctly identify that have shifted since the Arab uprisings, see what I did there, is that one, you have this growth of non-state actors. And because of the non-state actors and because of the external interventions, you are in a kind of new political environment, because countries that previously wouldn't have been able to exert so much power, Iran in particular, are now able to do so. So that's one. And then I think the second part of your argument is about the subhead about the post-American Middle East. I do think that that is a big part of it. I mean, the two of them collide and interact, but I do think that is a big part of the new reality that we all have to, in the region, we all have to acclimatize ourselves to, because the Americans may be, I don't believe that they're quite retreating. I mean, because it hasn't, we have to wait and see, you know, it's quite like Trump would come back. We don't know. So that idea that the Americans have inevitably retreated, I think is not necessarily an accurate one for now. We have to wait and see. But I do think that even if they haven't physically left, the idea is that they left. And the people in the region, in particular, some of these smaller countries, the Gulf states and so on, they no longer believe that the hegemon is going to be there, and all of the money and the political capital they invested in Washington, they don't believe that that might come to fruition. So I think when you put those two things together, I think it isn't unreasonable to say we are in a kind of new Middle East, and in any case, people in the region, particularly the politicians of the region, are interacting with each other as if it is a different environment to the one before.
Great, so we have, let's take two questions now.
Yep. Hello, Anne Kirsten Ron from the NC Middle Centre. Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting book presentation. I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure I will. And I might even I might even expose my students to it as well next time I teach IR Middle East. My question is more about what your mission is with this book. In which direction are you trying to push the debates on Middle East IR with this publication? I remember a conversation I had a few years ago with Stephen Walt, who was visiting my former department, and he was concerned that IR in general, not just Middle East IR, was sliding towards a more empiricist approach and away from these old theoretical and more parsimonious perspectives. And it seems, at least some of your former publications, are dragging the Middle East IR debate back towards the classical IR theories. What's the aim of this book? I didn't hear you citing any of these classical debates between the realist, materialist on the one hand and the idealist, constructivist perspectives on the other. I did hear you citing, presenting some kind of approach to the exogenous versus endogenous factors transforming the region, but I'm curious as to know how you position yourself on this, let's call it a spectrum between empiricism and Waltian parsimonious classical IR theory.
Can we take another question?
Francesco Belcastro, University of Derby. Thanks, Chris. I was actually, again, I've not read the book, so apologies if the answer is on page 1. Sorry, that's too busy doing football. I confess. I was actually interested and puzzled by the last conflict, the Horn of Africa. I was reading just yesterday a chapter on the growing role of the Emirates and other Gulf countries and the relations with India, right? So could it be that with a more sort of international, more solid and broader foreign policy by some key actors, the 10 conflicts that will explain the region in 20 years' time are going to be not necessarily in the Middle East, but the periphery? Is that something there that we should perhaps look at more? I don't know, Sudan, I don't know, wherever that is. Thank you.
So.
Sure, I'll try and answer those. May I answer Kristen's one? I'm not sure if you want to talk about my contribution.
I am very interested in the question. I like this sort of spectrum.
Yeah. So in all honesty, there's a very I did a podcast with some of our mutual friends, Simon Maben, who does the podcast on the list. And they said, Chris, I need to talk to you about one of the questions. I need to talk to you about footnote 8. So look, only a scholar would say that. And footnote 8 of the introduction says, to avoid overloading the reader with academic jargon, I have opted not to name these theories of international relations in the main text. However, for those of you who want to learn about them, I will offer more detail here. And so I basically very consciously didn't want to put IR theory in this book. And it's for the reason that actually Steve Walt, I chatted to Steve Walt about this a few years ago. And he's actually really good at this. He basically recognizes that the problem in IR actually is IR. Is that international relations, theorists and scholars spend far too much time talking to one another and not enough time talking to the people they're actually, in theory, talking about and to, which is, people involved in the international, whether it's practitioners or sort of activists or whomever it is. And so having really labored with that question with my previous book, so Battle for Syria was actually a really kind of detailed empirical work. But when I really felt compelled to include this sort of scholarly framework in, and getting feedback from people saying, I like the book, but it's quite dense, that stuff. I was like, right, okay, I'm taking it out this one. For the academic community amongst us, it's an inter-ref book. Like we've done the last ref, we've got another ref, so this is the exercise we have to do every 5 or 6 years to show our research quality. And this is my luxury of being like, I'm going to keep the theory out of this one. But at the same time, it is underpinned by some of those debates. And a lot of, I do make points in the book about the internal, the external. In IR terms, it's actually quite neoclassical realist, for want of a better word. But I'm not a kind of a theoretical Puritan. I am very happy to use and do use a lot of post-colonial theory, post-colonial ideas in there. But that kind of overarching framework is very much got a kind of a neoclassical realist scaffold, which is basically, it's about the structure of the international system, but we've got to understand what's going on with domestic politics to see what's going on. Right. So that's in there. That's my actual mission, to answer your question, is to make something that's accessible and not too IR. So it's kind of IR for the non-IR people. I hope that answers your question, Chris.
You're a realist, I think, in the sense that you accept the principle of external, particularly Western intervention in the Middle East. You don't, even though you criticize the United States in particular for what's happened, you don't think you criticize the underpinnings of the idea that a hegemonic power can intervene externally.
Yes, but not that it shouldn't. So that's the thing. Oh, sorry, I think I make a very big point of that. Is that actually at the end I'm very much concluding like this is the problem. The problem actually in the in the region as a whole is and again I'm not proposing a solution because it's it's slightly pie in the sky to say everyone just stop intervening and everything will be fine. But I am very much looking at that external role and towards the end start talking about China and how China is now positioning itself in the region as not in the same with the same level of military interest as the United States once did, but certainly the level of economic interest. I mean, all states in the Middle East, apart from Jordan and Israel, have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Very conscious out, and actually, even though Israel's not part of it, there's been a huge amount of Chinese economic investment in Israel. So there's very much this kind of, extra-regional presence in the region, and again, quite a strong thread of the book is that this has almost exclusively had negative consequences going back to British and French colonialism and so on, actually creating the state system in the first place. So yeah, yes, they do intervene, but I think, hope anyway, the emphasis is this hasn't been productive, this hasn't been a good thing for the region. They end up being quite counterfactual, of course, in that sense. Francesco, Horn of Africa. So I love researching the Horn of Africa chapter, by the way. It's my favorite chapter I did, and it's probably because it's the one that I knew the least about, so to do the most work. Actually, really found it absolutely fascinating to see the same patterns. Again, this is something that I having spent so much time sort of deep in Syria, but then also sort of historically at Lebanon and Iraq and so on, to say actually all these patterns have happened in the Horn of Africa as well, in slightly different ways, but still going on there. So it was fascinating. Chapters, right, but it was very much on the premise of what you're talking about, that this was a region where it's very hard to say, oh, like, there's deep historical interests for Middle Eastern powers or regional powers in this area, like Somalia or Eritrea or Ethiopia or Djibouti. Like, they don't have that historical link there. There's a cultural, Somalia's in the Arab League. There's a cultural link. We could maybe go to sort of like Christian links with sort of Egypt and so on, but like in Ethiopia, but it's not it's not deep in the way that some people made the arguments about, say, Iran's deep historical interests in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and so on. This is a region that regional powers actively chose to intervene in as a means of getting one over their rivals. So Qatar had this long historical connection with Somalia, and the UAE, when it fell out with Qatar around sort of time of the Arab blockade, so the Qatar blockade, and a little bit before then with the rivalry around the Muslim Brotherhood, said, right, okay, we can outflank Qatar here, so let's get involved in Somalia. Turkey does the same. It's a really active choice. And so, yes, there is the possibility that as other battlegrounds no longer seem viable or attractive, or too risky, look for somewhere else. And you mentioned Sudan. We're already seeing that. Like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are backing different sides in the Sudanese civil war, but no one's writing about it at the moment. Well, they are writing about it, but no one seems to pay much attention to it in the Western press.
So we have one more question here, and we have two questions from the online. It's not a question. Oh, okay. So let's take one from here.
Richard Baltrump from the Middle East Centre. Firstly, do you have some reservations about using a title that's a little bit sort of reductivist sounding, and looking at it and thinking of with a title 10 conflicts that explain Africa, and what would be said about that type of title? And then secondly, do you find a balance in how to weigh up the importance or impact of external actors? Do you avoid overstating the impact of external actors? Thank you.
Richard's point, yes, so that on the one hand, there's always the risk of reduction when you're trying, being too reductive when you're trying to come up with a catchy title that will grab people's attentions. I was very, very keen to insert the word again to explain the new Middle East rather than the Middle East, because to actually say, like, to explain the Middle East, you're absolutely right, that'd be completely reductive. That would be the equivalent of saying I'm explaining Africa or a whole region based on these 10 conflicts. By putting the new, as I see it anyway, by putting the new Middle East, and this is my phrase, this is my term, I am trying to explain this particular phenomena called the new Middle East. I am not trying to explain, as I say in the book, repeatedly in the introduction, everything about it. So that's my point. Overstating the impact of external actors, Richard, that's an interesting question, because I think that I worry, again, in my field and when I look at, people understate the presence of external actors. In fact, that's what I'm fighting. A lot of the time, what we get in a lot of the scholarship is, a lack of a focus on the international. We sort of drill down so much into sort of like the local, which is fascinating and important. And I so much of my work relies on people that do that. But so often what they're also doing at the same time, and this is what I ask scholars like me keep saying, is you're not looking at how this interacts with the outside world. Like, it's really important that, when we're talking about Syria, when we were talking about this in a conversation the other day, when they're having the debates in the Syrian opposition about, shall we take up arms? The willingness of outside states to give one half of that argument arms really affects the arguments they're having. If no one's willing to give them arms, the conversation is different. So, I think that, that is often lost. And a lot of, for example, the narratives around the Syrian civil war at that time were all talking about this debate as if it's just this pure debate on ideas, and it wasn't just about ideas, it was about structures and circumstances.
Well, I will say about the point you're making about the Syrian conflict, but it applies to other conflicts as well. One of the difficulties, I know at the beginning I was trying to delineate differences between myself and Christopher, but I do think that part of the difficulty with understanding the Middle East is that there is this interaction. It isn't merely that something happens on the ground and it has no relevance to either regional actors or external actors. It absolutely does. And when you are talking about a hegemonic power which has as much immense military and financial power as the United States, that obviously shifts the dial significantly. When you are saying about people sitting in a room, for example, during the Syrian revolution uprising in the beginning, the spring, when they are sitting around talking, inevitably there are going to be people. That's Bashar. You're talking about. That's a great impression of Bashar al-Assad for those of you who know. But when you are sitting around in the room and people are trying to figure out like what direction to take, and they're trying to take that direction in the face of bullets, people being arrested, people being tortured, you have to understand that the very willingness of external actors to supply people in that room gives those people most prone to violence or to making the arguments about violence. It gives them immense power. Because the people in the room who are saying, look, let's keep this non-violent, they know that those guys in the room who are saying, let's not keep it non-violent, can go out tomorrow and bring weapons and do something to them. So it shifts the entirety of the argument, and it makes it much harder for you to continue to be peaceful or to want to keep it political.
Now, I'm a bit anxious about time. We're already 7 minutes over, but I'm going to give you the last 3 online questions. So we have a question about terminology, asking you, how do you explain calling the conflict in Syria as a civil war when considering significant involvement of external actors like Russia? Another one asking about the role of the US, and can you explain the changes in the US policy towards the region? And did the shift lead to increased involvement from powers like Iran and Russia? And an interesting question also about what you learned from teaching. So it says, I found it really interesting that your use of the terms such as the Arab Spring has changed as a result of your teaching experience. In what other ways do you feel that as an academic, your language and approach have changed because of your teaching?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Faisal, do you want to jump on any of those, or do you want to?
Floors all yours.
I'll start, and then you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, terminology. So I mean, we had this repeated. I mean, it's incredibly depressing because it just, and I those of us, focused on Syria at the height of the civil war. There was a huge debate about the term you use. Do you use it civil war? Do you use it like war on the Syrian people, which is often people in the opposition were saying, look, this isn't a civil war. We're not fighting back. At least we're not fighting back the same way. This is, Assad trying to kill us. It's like there was use of the word genocide quite a lot. It's a bit like with Gaza now. You use these phrases, and they're highly emotive phrases, and people that are deeply involved in these conflicts, will not take kindly to political scientists like me trying to draw up a list and say, well, you haven't hit these criteria, so it's not a genocide, or it's not, and I can completely understand that. When we looked at Syria, I repeatedly said it was probably all those things. Yeah. All those things happening at once. It was a civil war. It was an internationalized conflict. At times it was a war on the Syrian people by its government. It was all those things at once. But I use the term civil war most often because, again, as the political scientist, that's the phenomena that I'm really focusing on. And one of the things we do in political science a lot is comparison. So we look at other civil wars and other situations, other internationalized conflicts, and compare them. That said, if I was a genocide scholar, I would be looking at other genocides, and I would say, right, well, do we classify using our definitions of genocide, that we use in like Rwanda and elsewhere? Do we apply that to the Syrian model and the Gaza model? Like that says more about me as a scholar than the sort of correctness or not of the phenomena that I'm focusing on. So terminology is it's a very sensitive and loaded topic, issue, and that's just explaining where I'm coming from particularly. But as always, with all the caveats, I'm not saying this is the only way of looking at something. The US's changing role in the region Yeah, I mean, so the question was, does the US change of role of the region affect the behavior of others like Iran and Russia? Yes, it absolutely does. But I maintain, and I make this really big point, actually I wrote it more in my previous book on the battle for Syria, but also in this book, the US is, for Iran, the change was because of 2003. Like, prior to 2003, Iran was boxed in by Saddam Hussein. It had this connection with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but that was about it, and had an alliance with Syria, but very much at this kind of like horizontal level. There's sort of, we deal with just the, with the government of Syria and the government of Iran, but that was about it. After, Saddam Hussein was removed and Iraq became this weak state, it was very easy for Iran to penetrate that state politically and build a real base there. And from there, effectively the doors of the Middle East was open. It was able to sort of like, deepen its connection, for example, with the Houthis in Yemen. Like, previously, it didn't have much, beyond a sort of spiritual connection and a loose revolutionary ideology. It wasn't like there was a hotline between Tehran and the Houthis, but actually, after Iran had that foothold in Iraq, they were able to build that up. I mean, more specifically after 2015, Saudi-led intervention in Yemen. So yes, so I suppose a US behavior affected that with Iran. With Russia, I think that was about. I think that's more about the broader phenomenon I'm describing, which is that the US, in stepping back from the region or being less willing to get involved, allowed Russia to sort of see opportunity to be most obviously Syria, but also Libya and via Wagner, even in Sudan, places like that. I'll leave the final thing about what I've learned from teaching. I'm going to let Faisal talk about those other comments.
Actually, I thought we might bring it to a close because I imagine that a lot of people in the room want to talk to you afterwards.
In which case, I will just say one thing about what I've learned from teaching. So, I mean, I think people go about teaching in different ways, especially when they teach about something like the international relations in the Middle East, which is a very, again, emotive topic. I have always been really conscious, painfully conscious, I am not from the region. I'm looking at taking this role, this kind of step back position. And that might also explain a little bit why I'm more reticent to use words like revolution and spring and things like that, because I see myself, despite having lived in the region, having a very deep connection to the region, as being an observer of it rather than being from it. And many of my students, we have a wonderful university, Queen Mary, down the road. Many of them from the Middle East, many of them have really close connections to the region, and I'm far more interested in what they've got to say and how they identify with the region and the terminology that they use, rather than me coming and imposing right. You can't call it that, you can't call it this. So it makes me a little bit sort of conscious of doing that and hearing what they say. And the question on the Arab Spring, after I remember it's about 2012, 2013, people were saying, people from Egypt, people from Syria were saying to me, the Arab Spring is a Western term. We don't use this term. Why are you using this term? Like, you use something else, And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. Like, and I wasn't sort of so like, but that had an effect on me. Likewise, we're finding now with the Gaza conflict, like the use of terminology. Really, I had one student that was really bothered that I didn't refer to Hamas as terrorists. I talked to them, I used them like militants or whatever it was, and said that they're terrorists. Why do you use them as terrorists? And I said, well, because in my past experience teaching, militant is less likely to really offend people's sensitivities than me using terrorist for a term that some people would question. So I think you learn as a teacher to be very, very conscious of people's sensitivities, to try to navigate that as much as possible, while still possessing your own views and your own sort of assessment. You can't kind of be completely, I suppose, spineless on it, but you do need to be sensitive to those issues. So I think that's what this talk.
Great, thank you very much, Christopher and Faisal. I mean, we come to this to the end of the event. I very much enjoyed the discussion between you two and every question from the audience. So thank you all for staying with us beyond the end time of the event. And as we said, there will be copies of the books to buy and be signed by Christopher. So thank you very much again. And thank you for the Middle East Center for visiting this, especially for Nadia and myself for organizing the event.